Good morning to everyone.
Good morning.
We will be, we first of all want to thank you for the pastor having and his family being able to have a good time. I trust it was a good time away.
Blessing.
So that's why you see me up here today. And we will be looking at the book of Judges. You can turn to the first chapter of Judges. And while you're turning there, I'll just give us a very broad background of what brings us all the way to Judges. Back in Genesis, God makes a covenant with Abraham. He promises Abraham that he will be the father of a great nation. He promises that nation will have land, and he promises through that nation and through Abraham that he's going to bless the whole world. He passes that on to his son Isaac, and then Isaac unto his son Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons. They will be the 12 tribes of Israel, which will be the nation that God promised. One of those sons, Joseph, becomes very prominent in Egypt, becomes a ruler under Pharaoh. He moves the whole family, which is about less than 100 people at that point in time, into Egypt because of a famine and also for their protection. When we open up the book of Exodus, we now find ourselves about 300 and plus years further on. Those 100 people have now turned into a couple of million at least. Then Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt at that time, becomes very concerned, feeling that they might revolt. So he puts them into slavery. God raises up a man, Moses, to lead them out of slavery and lead them to the land he promised Abraham. And along that way, they end up going up to the land, get camped outside of it. They send out 12 spies. 2 of those were Joshua and Caleb, who bring back good report that they can take the land. All the other spies say, no, it's too big. It's too fortified. The people there are very warlike, and we'll never be able to overcome them. The people revolt and won't go in, so God sends that generation into the wilderness to wander for 40 years until they die. And he intends to bring the second generation into the promised land. And at that point in time, while they're wandering, Moses sins and therefore is not allowed to go into the promised land either. And we find that when Moses dies, then his second in command, who is Joshua, is to lead the people in. He leads the people in, and they are very successful in bringing Canaanites in the land under control. And when we leave the book of Joshua, Joshua has coming to the point of his death, getting close to it. He brings all the tribes together, and they divide up the land. And each tribe is apportioned a certain amount of property within the new nation. And when we come up into the book of Judges, now it's up to those tribes now to take possession of that land. And that's where Judges 1 starts in. So that's just the background. We're going to read all of chapter 1 and verse 1 through 5 and 2. So we've got a big long read. Now it came about after the death of Joshua that the sons of Israel inquired of the Lord, saying, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? The Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand. Then Judah said to Simeon his brother, come up with me into the territory allotted me, that we might fight against the Canaanites, and I in turn will go with you into the territory allotted you. So Simeon went with him. Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands, and they defeated 10,000 men at Bezek. They found Adoni-Bezek in Bezek, and fought against him, and they defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. But Adoni-Bezek fled, and they pursued him and caught him, and cut off his thumbs and big toes. Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to gather up scraps under my table, as I have done. So God has repaid me. So they brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. Then the sons of Judah fought against Jerusalem and captured it, and struck it with the edge of the sword, and set the city on fire. Afterward the sons of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites, living in the hill country and in the Negev and in the lowland. So Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron formerly was Kiriath Arba, and they struck Shishai and Ahiman and Talmai. Then from there he went against the inhabitants of Debir. Now the name of Debir formerly was Kiriath Sephar. And Caleb said, the one who attacks Kiriath Sephar and captures it, I will even give my daughter Achsah for a wife. Othniel, the son of Kenza, Caleb's younger brother, captured it, so he gave him his daughter Achsah for a wife. Then it came about when she came to him that she persuaded him to ask her father for a field. Then she alighted from her donkey, and Caleb said to her, what do you want? She said to him, give me a blessing, since you have given me the land of the Negev. Give me also the springs of water. So Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. The descendants of the Canaanite, Moses' father-in-law, went up from the city of palms with the sons of Judah to the wilderness of Judah, which is the south of Ararat. And they went and lived with the people. Then Judah went with Simeon his brother, and they struck the Canaanites living in Zephath, and utterly destroyed it. So the name of that city was called Hormah. And Judah took Gaza with its territory, and Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. Now the Lord was with Judah, and they took possession of the hill country, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley, because they had iron chariots. Then they gave Hebron to Caleb, as Moses had promised, and he drove out from there the 3 sons of Anak. But the sons of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem, so the Jebusites have lived with the sons of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. Likewise, the house of Joseph went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. The house of Joseph spied out Bethel. Now the name of the city was formerly Luz. The spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, please show us the entrance to the city, and we will treat you kindly. So he showed them the entrance to the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword. But they let the man and his family go free. The man went into the land of the Hittites and built a city and named it Luz, which is its name to this very day. But Manasseh did not take possession of Beth Shean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ibleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. So the Canaanites persisted in living in that land. It came about when Israel became strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not drive them out completely. Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who were living in Gezer, and the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them, so that the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, or the inhabitants of Nabalah, so the Canaanites lived among them and became subject to forced labor. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or of Alhab, or Akzib, or Ahilbah, or Aphik, or of Rehob. So the Asherites lived among the Canaanites and the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, or the inhabitants of Beth Anah, but lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, and the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath became forced labor for them. Then the Amorites forced the sons of Dan into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the valley. Yet the Ammonites persisted in living in Mount Heres, in Alajan, and in Shalabim. But when the power of the house of Joseph grew strong, they became forced labor. The border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akabam and Selah and upward. Now the angel of the Lord came from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you out of Egypt and led you into the land which I have sworn to your fathers, and I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And as for you, you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land. You shall tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed me. What is this you have done? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they will become as thorns in your side, and their gods will be a snare to you. When the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the sons of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept. So they named that place Bochim, and they sacrificed to the Lord. Let's pray. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight. Amen. Well, we read something like this and we wonder, most of us know a little bit about the book of Judges, and it's not one of those books we often visit. It's a historical book. Most times you don't see much preaching out of historical books. We are doing the book of Acts right now, so that's probably the most historical, the book that most pastors, when they do preach a historical book, preach at it. And we look at all these strange names, and we look at this whole beginning section here, and we begin to wonder, what does it really have to do with anything? But this really has a lot of good things for us to learn. And despite what it seems like just a list of battles and little things going on, there's really a lot going on. This book, this part here is part of the introduction of the book of Judges. When we look at the book of Judges, it's divided basically like this. This introductory section we have, the first thing is just basically a list of what happened. It's just a list of all the battles and a recount of what happened during the occupation. Then that part, and when we started reading in 2, is God's assessment of what happened there. Then we go on, and the next thing is the book shows what was the result. Actions have consequences, right? Actions have consequences, and in this introduction, this really is, and 3 still continues, is what happens is what are the consequences of the actions that had occurred before. Then we get into the bulk of the book where God raises up judges. So we have the stories of the judges in there. And then within that, we end on 2 stories at the end of the book of Judges that have nothing to do with judges at all as far as judges ruling. And they show the decline both in the spiritual and moral aspects of the country at that point in time, of the nation at that point in time. So that's kind of a broad outlook of what goes on in the book of Judges. And everything is set up by what we've just read. Well, actually by the chapter 1. Everything is set up, and it looks like there's just a list of names and so on, and battles going on, and then every once in a while we have these little vignettes of something like this happening or something like that happening, and it seems like this is just kind of like information, but really there is a lot going on here, and that's what we're going to look at today. And when we look at this, the first 20 verses is actually talking about Judah, and when we get to 21 all the way to the end of chapter 1, which is verse 35, we're looking at the other tribes with a special emphasis on Ephraim and Manasseh. And then we get into chapter 2, 1 through 5, where we see God's assessment of what's going on. So, first thing, let's read. We'll take this section by section, and let's make sure where I want to be. So each section, so in this first section, this verse 1 through 20, we're talking about Judah and its occupation of the land. Again, the land has pretty much been conquered. The armies of the Canaanites are pretty much decimated, but there's still people living there. And right now, the tribes are supposed to come in and go finish up what needs to be done and occupy the land that Joshua had given them back at the end of Joshua. And first part, we see Judah is called by God first to go. In that, we have Judah's account, or the account of Judah taking the land. And in that account, we have 2 little vignettes that happen, and these little stories that are stuck in between. And when you see that happening in Scripture, it means you want to take a look. That's going to tell you that there's something happening here, that this little story comes in the midst of this account, this account of this occupation. And then in the second part, we have one little vignette along with Ephraim and then the other tribes and their account of how they occupied the land. So starting in Judges 1, we're going to look at the first 4 verses to start with. Now it came about after the death of Joshua that the sons of Israel inquired of the Lord, saying, Who shall go up for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? The Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand. Then Judah said to Simeon his brother, Come up with me into the territory allotted me, that we might fight against the Canaanites. I in turn will go with you into the territory allotted you. So Simeon went with him. So what we have here in the book of Judges, the first thing we notice is the death of Joshua. And that is significant in this way, that in Exodus it begins with the death of Joseph, and Joshua begins with the death of Moses, and then Judges begins with the death of Joshua. And what is being shown here, despite the fact that these leaders that are prominent leaders that God has put in place die, the work of God continues on. Okay? Where there is not a stoppage once a leader leaves. And oftentimes we look at it, and when a leader is gone, in fact, if you go to battle, that's what you try to do, is take out the leaders and hope that the others would be in disarray. But we see a consistent record here in the historical books that even though leaders die, the work of God continues to go on uninterrupted. This is something we need to remember because the rest of the book is based on that, based on the fact of God's faithfulness, the fact that God continues the work despite the lack of leadership. In this case, when Joshua dies, there's not another leader appointed. And also, as we would look down even further into Judges, as we look in 2:18 and 19, there's a contrast being set up here right in the beginning. So 2:18 and 19. When the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them from the hand of the enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved for pity by their groaning because of those who pressed and afflicted them. But it came about when the judge died that they would turn back and act more correctly than their fathers, and following other gods to serve them and bow down before them, they did not abandon their practices of their stubborn ways. So we see there's a contrast already being set up for the rest of the book of Judges. Here we see there's a faithfulness by God to follow. Then we see at the death of each of the judges that will take up the prime part of the book, when that death occurs, the people scatter away from the Lord. But yet, the Lord raises up another judge for them. So even as we see here that the faithfulness of God is when the people obey, it is also when the people disobey. So the project or the point that God is making here is that He is faithful in all circumstances. He is not going to abandon His people no matter what they do. This first 4 verses that we are reading here that we just read is really the high point of this book, because we have two wonderful things going on here. The first thing is when Joshua dies, what's the first thing they do? They seek the Lord. Who should go in and start the occupation? They didn't know. Joshua hadn't left any instructions, so what do? They seek the Lord. And at the same time, as they're told that Judah is to go in, what does Judah do? Judah says to Simeon, why don't we the two of us go together? What had happened is Simeon was the smallest of the tribes by the time of Joshua, by the book of Joshua. They had gotten very little land, and so as a result, they had been given several cities in the territory of Judah to compensate them. Okay? So at this point, Judah says, well, Simeon, you have some of our land. Why don't you come with us? You have some of our cities. Why don't you come with us? And the two of us together will go doing this. Never is God's blessing upon the people of God more so when the relationships are right. So the vertical relationships are right? Because they sought God and to see who should go in first. And the horizontal ones are also right. Because not only does Judah go in thinking of its own self, but it thinks of his brother Simeon, that they too can go in together. And God brings a blessing that way. They have no problems at this point. And if you read these first 4 verses, you are set up for an expectation that the book of Judges is going to be a very positive book. It's going to be a book where we see how God works and the people work and everything goes, but unfortunately, that is not what turns out, is it? So these first 4 verses are really the highlight. If we would see the people of God operate in a sense like this, then there's always going to be positive results. There is not going to be negative results. But unfortunately, what happens is we end up with 2:18 and 19, where the judge dies and we see the people going into sin even more so than they were before, and God having to raise up another judge and another judge and another judge. And we are to see this first 4 verses as a total contrast of what's actually going to start happening in the book of Judges. So we ask ourselves, we're here in these first 4 verses, everything is wonderful, we're ready for the good news to start coming. What happened? What happened between here and 2:18 and 19? What's going on? Well, a lot has happened in here. We didn't see it, when you were reading it, it didn't seem like much was happening, but a lot was happening. So let's start in reading in the next section, and that's going to be 5 through 7. They found Adoni-Bezek in Bezek and fought against him, and they defeated that Canaanite and the Perizzites. But Adoni-Bezek fled, and they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to gather up scraps under my table as I have done. So God has repaid me. So they brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. This is the first crack in the relationship of what's happening in Judges. It doesn't seem, you say, Ray, well, there's not much what's going on here. We see the toes and thumbs being cut off and whatever, and the book of Judges is full of all this kind of stuff. And it is because what happens in the book of Judges, we move from God ruling to men ruling, and God letting the men rule, and when we see what happens in that type of turmoil. And so we see this Adoni-Bezek. Adoni-Bezek is probably not a person, but a title. Adonai means Lord, so he was probably the governor, or he was the leader of Bezek. And he comes here, and this little vignette is given in the middle of this, the first vignette here in the conquest by Judah. And we are to take notice, because the one thing that happens here is Adoni-Bezek says what? That justice has been done to me, because my thumbs and toes were cut off because I did the same to other people. That there has been, and in saying that, he says also that this is from God. So God, as I have done, in verse 7, as I have done, so God has repaid me. So he recognizes the fact that there is a providence going on. What he did to someone else is being revisited upon him. I guess in our culture now call that karma, but actually, I mean, that is a biblical concept. But what's important here to see is that he understood that he was being judged, and he feels like he is being judged justly. What you say to yourself, well, the thing that really everybody wants to know is why the toes and the thumbs going off, right? Think about it. If you were a warrior, how are you going to hold a sword if you don't have any thumbs? And how are you going to walk if you don't have any big toes? I mean, your balance is totally off. So that's what Adonai-Bezek had done to those kings, basically incapacitated them to be warriors anymore. But there is something really different happening here that we need to understand. So to do that, we're going to have to go over first to Genesis chapter 15. Keeping in mind this idea of justice that Adonai-Bezek is talking about. Genesis 15, we're going to read 13 through 16. This is God reiterating. God in chapter 12 of Genesis began making a covenant with Abraham. This is a formalizing of that covenant, but we're only interested in one little aspect of it right now. God said to Abram, "Now for certain that your descendants will be strangers in the land that is not yours, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. That was Egypt. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and after they will come out with many possessions." That's the Exodus. The Exodus out of, with Moses. "As for you, you will go with fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good old age." So Abraham is being told he won't see all this, because obviously it's going to be 400 years down the road or more. "Then in the fourth generation," that's his people, "will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete." Okay? So, to get an idea of what's happening here, as these people, as Israel comes to occupy this land, God had determined 400 years ago that he was going to judge these people. Their sin was not yet complete. And he knew at exact time, he knew the exact place when that sin would need to be dealt with. And he is using the nation of Israel to do that. And yet, what we need to understand is, how was God going to judge that nation? Well, we go over first now to Numbers 33. If you're in your Bible. You don't have to turn there if you don't want to, but I won't one too far. Numbers 33. And when we get to Numbers 33, we're going to look at 51 through 53. Okay, Numbers is when they are, at this part, they're wandering in the desert, and God is giving them instructions of what to do when the second generation goes into the land. "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you cross over the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, and destroy all their figured stones, and destroy all their molten images, and demolish all their high places. And you shall take possession of the land and live in it, for I have given the land to you to possess it." So they are to drive everybody out, destroy everything there. Okay? They are to take total possession of this land. This is God's judgment. He had decided to judge them 400 years previously. This is what he wants done in judgment. And he's using Israel to do that. See, there's a blessing and a cursing going on at the same time here, right? He's cursing, or he's punishing the Canaanites in the land for their sin, and at the same time he's blessing the nation of Israel by giving them that land. Okay, two things happening at the same time. Then we go over to Deuteronomy 7, and then we'll read 1 and 2. When the Lord your God brings you in, Deuteronomy is right when is Moses giving instructions right before his death, and right before Joshua will take over. When the Lord your God brings you into the land where you're entering to possess it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites and the Girgashites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and stronger than you. And when the Lord your God delivers them before you and you defeat them, then you shall utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them and show no favor to them. Okay? So now we have the marching orders. God has determined, and they would have known this. This is what they would have known, that God had determined that they were to go into this land, completely clear it out, kill everything that they can't drive out. This land was to be God's land for his people. There was not to be any compromising of any sort or anything. So what happened here? They compromised, didn't they? They didn't kill Adonai-Bezek, did they? What did they do? They put human justice to him. The justice that he had visited upon others, they visited upon him. And in a way, that's not wrong, because the Bible says that an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and that's the concept of that the punishment for something cannot be greater than the crime itself. So this equality of that happened here was actually in one biblical sense, correct. But it was wrong in that they did not do what the Lord had told them. Okay? And what do they say? They take him to Jerusalem and he dies there. And dies there. They don't say they take him to Jerusalem and kill him. They take him to Jerusalem and he dies there. Okay? So that's a significant thing. And this seems like a small point, doesn't it? One little man here, put in this little vignette here. Doesn't seem like it's much of a breach. But let's go ahead and start reading on. So let's read the next section. Let's read 8 through 10, and that'll go real quickly because there's really not much going on in that. Then the sons of Judah fought against Jerusalem and captured it and struck it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire. Afterward the sons of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites living in the hill country and in Negev. Negev is the desert. And in the lowland. So Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. Now the son of Hebron formerly was Kiriath-Naamah, was formerly Kiriath-Arba, and they struck Shishai and Ahiman and Talmai. So they're back on track here, aren't they? And the Lord has not visited anything of punishment on them for their lack yet, has he? So they go right on doing like they were doing before. And we move into the next section, which is basically 11 through 15, and we have this second little vignette. Then from there, he went against the inhabitants of Debir. Now the name of Debir formerly was Kiriath-Sepher, and Caleb said, the one who attacks Kiriath-Sepher and captures it will even be given my daughter Aksah for a wife. Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, captured it. So he gave him his daughter Aksah for a wife. Then it came about when she came to him, then she persuaded him to ask her father for a field, that she alighted from her donkey. And Caleb said to her, what do you want? She said to him, give me a blessing, since you have given me the land of the Negev. It's not actually given desert land, but it's land like desert land. Give me also springs of water. So Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. Okay, so that's through 15. So we have this little vignette coming in here at this point in time, okay? Why is this here? Well, I think it's here to show two different things. Okay, these people here, Caleb, Othniel actually, because of his dealing with Caleb here, will become the first judge of Israel. But that's further on down the road in chapter 3. But this is here, I think, for two very good reasons. One, it makes the point that there was a faithful generation. Joshua and Caleb, they were the two spies, remember, that gave the good report. And God shows what a faithful people is like. Okay? Because this is going to stand in contrast when we read in chapter 2, and then it follows after that part into the book of Judges, that there was a generation that grew up that did not know the Lord. Okay? This is going to be the contrast here. And what other contrast is happening here is that these folks are not actually true Israelites. Okay? They're actually Edomites. They're from the tribe, one of the tribes that came out of Esau. If you remember Jacob and Esau, Jacob was blessed, Esau was not. And so these were proselytes. They came into Jerusalem, into Judaism as a proselyte. They were not truly a called people as from Abraham. Okay, so they're proselytes. So we obviously see the contrast again. The proselytes versus the real people when we come down into the Judges, how they act versus how these people act. You know, when we come into the New Testament, we see Jesus going to Gentiles now and again, and he's totally amazed, doesn't he say, I don't see faith like this among the people of Israel. And that's the contrast that's being set up here, too. Look what's happening here, right? Look how well this is managed. Caleb offers up his daughter to the one that will take the city of Debir. He's faithful in taking his. He doesn't in any way, and we'll see that further on when we read, he doesn't in any way move away from what he knows he's supposed to do. He's in the process of doing whatever. So he, being obedient to the Lord, knowing what his territory is. I'm taking the territory the Lord gave me. And as he does that, he says, well, I'm going to give my daughter to one who can get city of Debir. They do that. As a result, he gives a marriage to his daughter in marriage to Othniel, and then he gives the daughter some land, right? Well, the daughter says, well, you know, the land is wonderful, but I need a blessing besides that. You know, I need a blessing because that land is desert-like and I need some springs of water. And she approaches her dad in such a wonderful way, right? And this is kind of setting up the, if you look at this whole reaction, and we're not going into all the details, but if we go from this to one of the last stories in the book of Judges about the concubine of the Levite and what happened in all of that, this is setting up a contrast of what the two different ways are. The way of the Lord, this is what it looks like. It's peaceful, it's gentle, it's kind, everybody gets along, there's a justice going on, there's a concern that everybody is treated fairly and honestly and taken care of, versus we go into the book of Judges and everything falls apart over there. So that's why this is sitting there. It's showing this contrast of a faithful generation, and I think it's trying to make the point on not to, as we come into the New Testament again, you know how the Jews were, you know, we're the sons of Abraham, we're the progeny, we're the result of Moses. They're the people that make sure that we're right. But these people, because it was not given them, and they had to earn, not necessarily earn it, but that they had to come into it without the privilege of the others, valued it more.
That's right.
They valued it a lot more. They saw the value in what they had because they saw what it was not to have it. And I think, you know, we look at what's going around in our country even now, and we see people in this type of rebellion like the people in the Judges, and they don't, because they've had so much, they don't really value what they have. This concept of when you are having to come from the outside and to the inside, basically, you see the difference, you know the difference. And therefore, what you have and what you see is of great value to you. Okay, so I think that's what's going on here. This is what the writer of Judges is trying to do, who is probably Samuel. So when we get through this second vignette, we move on and we get into verse 16. Okay, so verse 16 there's one little verse that sits here and it doesn't seem like much, but something important is happening here. Let me get back to the next page. The descendants of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up from the city of palms with the sons of Judah to the wilderness of Judah, which is the south of Arad, and they went and lived with the people. So what in the world is this all about? Well, during the Exodus, the Midianites, or the sons, the descendants of Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, the two are interrelated. They're either similar tribes, one tribe or another, but the Midianites and the Kenites are the same people. They helped Moses. Moses therefore said, whatever blessings we give are going to be put upon you. So while they're wandering out in numbers in the desert, they're lost and they don't know where to go. And he asked a Kenite to help him out, and Kenite says, no, I'm going back to my people. And Moses says to him, but please stay with us, help us, guide us through this land. We don't know this land, and if you do, the blessings God is giving us, I will give to you. And so this is a fair treatment, okay? These people are now going with the people of Judah. They are fairly being given what Moses had promised. So there was a vow made, and they're living up to that vow. But the problem is what do? They allow them to settle in the land. Okay. They're an ally, and they're letting them settle in the land, right? They were supposed to drive everybody out of the land, right? They're allowing this ally to come in and settle amongst the people in the land there. And that's where they themselves, to this point, are not settling in the land. The Jews, the people of Israel, but they've started a slippery slope, and we'll see. Because now they've let one of their allies settle into that land without driving out the people. Okay? So that's another step. Do you see where we're going? One step at a time. And this is the important lesson of Judges. And this is the important lesson of this part of Judges, Judges chapter 1, is that it's not these big disobedient acts or anything. It's these small little things that start to build upon one another that is going to end up tripping up the nation. So we see that. And then again, the Lord doesn't judge here, so we're going to read 17 through the first part of 19. Then Judah went with Simeon his brother, and they struck the Canaanites living in Zephath, and utterly destroyed it. So the name of the city was called Hormah. And Judah took Gaza with its territory, and Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. Now the Lord was with Judah, and they took possession of the hill country. Okay, so they took possession. They're back on track again, right? So that we've gone one off track, back on track. Second off track, back on track. Now we're on to the third off track. Okay, second part of 19. But they could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had iron chariots. Okay, you say, well, that's a logical thing. An iron chariot in that day and time would have been a formidable thing for a people of agrarian basic, even though they were warriors, they would not be able to fight against that. It would truly be an issue. I mean, it would be far superior. It's like going into Afghanistan and with the camels fighting against tanks. I mean, the same sort of thing. It's that much of a difference. But it's not what we read there that's so important. It's what we don't read there, right? There's no seeking after the Lord there, right? Has the Lord been able to overcome things like this? I think he brought down the whole walls of Jericho by marching around it and shouting, right? So they should have known that this was not an impossible thing to occur. But for some reason, we don't read in here that they seek the Lord. They don't seek the Lord to find out what needs to be done in this situation, right? What happened at the beginning of the book of Judges? They sought the Lord to see who was supposed to go in first. Well, this obviously is a situation where you seek the Lord of what you do. And we don't read anything of that here. So that's the third failure, isn't it? We're moving further and further into, and this failure is prominent in the fact that now they have failed to drive out the peoples, right? They can't drive these people out. And they are supposed to drive these people out. They are, in this case, incapable. We're going to read it on and we're going to see what else happens, but in this case, they are just totally incapable. Okay, and then they gave Hebron to Caleb, verse 20, as Moses had promised, and he drove them out from the 3 sons of Anak. So here's again the faithfulness of Caleb. Okay, Anak, why is Anak significant here? Because that was one of the types of people that they were afraid of. That's when the originally group was supposed to go into. They said they're the sons of Anak out there. The sons of Anak were apparently very warrior-like, extremely big and tall, and of a stature that frightened them. But here, Caleb isn't afraid, is he? He goes right in and he does. And again, a sense of Caleb's faithfulness, that generation's faithfulness, out of them, Joshua and Caleb, both of them faithful. And what the difference is. And there is no moving of these chariots out because the people don't seek God and don't trust that God can do it. Okay? Then we move now into 21 through 36. We leave Judah and we're going to start talking about each of the other tribes. And we're going to go through this a lot quicker. There's not as much to talk about in here, a couple things, but not as much. But the sons of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the sons of Benjamin in Jerusalem this day. Look what happened. Judah was unable to take care of the chariots. They had let the allies move in and without driving out the people. And the first thing that happens, well, Benjamin says, well, they didn't do it and they didn't do it, so it's no big deal, I didn't do it. Likewise, the house of Joseph went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with him. The house of Joseph is Ephraim and Manasseh. That was his 2 sons. The house of Joseph, okay, then we come into this little vignette. This is an important vignette here. The house of Joseph spied out Bethel. Now the name of the city was formerly Luz. The spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, "Please show us to the entrance to the city, and we will treat you kindly." So he showed them the entrance to the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword, but they let the man and all his family go free. The man went into the land of the Hittites, still part of the land of Canaan, and built a city and named it Luz, which is its name to this day. Okay, so they go in. And this is kind of a reflection of, you can't help but draw the comparison of what happened when they went to Jericho, right? They sent the spies in, but what happened with Rahab? She says, "We know your God is real. The people have a great fear of you." And she protected those spies, gave them a way out and whatever, so they protected her. Okay? So, but the mind thought here is a lot different, right? It's not, well, this guy is a proselyte and one who wants to come on our side, so on and so forth. Well, he's a convenient guy. We'll get him to betray his people and save him, right? So in their mind, probably they're thinking, well, this is, it happened this way in Jericho. This is similar. So we're seeing a degradation of the way they're even thinking at this point in time. So they give this man a thing. So they conquered the city. Well, what, did they conquer the city? No. They moved the city. They let the guy go and build the city somewhere else. They may have conquered that city, but they let him go back and rebuild somewhere else. So the city is never really destroyed, and they're not driven out. Those specific people that were in there at that point in time, except for that man and his family, but then they rebuilt the city somewhere else. So there is no complete doing as the Lord had called them to do. And we move on. But Manasseh did not take possession of verse 27, But Manasseh did not take possession of Beth Shean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ibleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. So the Canaanites persisted in living in that land. Okay? We just see it. We're getting wrong? Okay. He's telling me I'm wrong, so let me do that. But okay, so, and then let's just read through. So they give, Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Catron. These are all the tribes, right? We're just going down the tribe list. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Acco. So the Asherites lived among them. Now Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Thing. And then we have something else start happening. And they became forced labor for them. Okay? And then we come to this part. Then the Amorites forced the sons of Dan into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down in the valley. So what we have, all the way up to Dan, the tribes are in control. They're saying, but what they're doing is they're not driving them out, they're making them forced labor. And then we finally get to the total result. They come to Dan, and Dan isn't in control now. Right? Who's in control when you read that? Then the Amorites forced the sons of Dan into the hill country. The Amorites saying, you can stay up there, but you ain't coming down here. It's not Dan giving instruction now, but the Amorites giving instruction. And not only that, to add insult to injury, verse 36, there's actually boundaries set up for Amorites within the land. This is the Amorites' land within the land. So we see that there's just this total descent of disobedience. We started in 5 with the failure to kill Adonai-Bezek, and they used human justice instead of God's justice. They, in 16, allow an ally to settle into the land among the people. In 19, they are failure to conquer the people with the chariots. Then there's a failure to drive out in verse 21, and they lived among them. 26, the inhabitant of the land is allowed to rebuild a city. And then we have multiple times where there's a failure to drive out, but instead they enslave the people and let them stay. And finally we come to where the Amorites defeat, where Dan can settle. So this has just been one descent in this whole thing. This is showing how we get from the first 4 verses of chapter 1 over to verse 2, 18 and 19. That's what happened. This is how it happened. And it didn't, when you read through this right from the beginning, it doesn't seem like there's much happening, but there is so much going on in this historical record. And this is one thing we need to probably mention at this point too, is the geography that's occurring in here. And we don't have to go into every specific detail, but what we're seeing here is the conquering of the land from the south up to the north. So Judah is the most southern tribe with its property, Benjamin all the way up. And we notice that the most successful of the tribes is Judah, and then it disintegrates from there and gets worse and worse and worse. But we know when we come to the time when the kingdom is split, that eventually, because of the amount of disobedience in the northern kingdoms, they would be totally destroyed. The southern kingdom would be allowed to come back from exile. They would not. And that is being set up right even here. So that these actions that have occurred here have long-term effects way into the future. And it's a way we need to think. These small things that we are doing do make a difference in the way we handle our stuff. So we look into this judgment real quickly in 2:1 through 5. We've already talked about Numbers 33 and Deuteronomy 7. So let's look at Exodus 34, 12 and 13 real quick. turn there. Not one I didn't have enough markers for. But rather you are to tear down their altars and smash their sacred pillars and cut down their Asherim, for you shall not worship any other god, for the Lord whose name is jealous is a jealous God. Otherwise you may make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they would play the harlot with the gods and sacrifice their gods, and someone might invite you to eat this sacrifice. And you might take on daughters, and we could go on and on. But what the Lord, when we look at this condemnation by the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim, angel of the Lord. We won't go into all of that right now. As for you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down the altars. But what does it say in 2b? But you have not obeyed me. What is this you have done?
That's right.
Okay? Therefore, I also say, I will not. So now there's a switch. God is now not going to go before them to drive out the inhabitants of the land. That's the judgment that the Lord is going to have. And then when we come in to 2 and 3, we see the consequences of these actions. We see what happened, what these actions were. This next section says, well, what happened because they did what they did? And that's a whole another sermon. But before we to close, I did want to read out of this one commentary. I couldn't sum it up better than this. So we're going to use this commentary summary of this period, and it helps us to think, because our country itself is in a country that was once very much a Christian nation, in the sense that it valued Christian ethics and Christian morals. It doesn't mean everybody in the country was a Christian. And we have slowly and surely, bit by bit, moved away from that. And now we have a generation out there that doesn't know the Lord. And we see what's happening. And when you read through the book of Judges, what's happening out there is no different than what happened in the whole book of Judges. So let's read this. The survey of Israel's fortune after the death of Joshua begins positively enough, with the Israelites consulting Yahweh, the tribes, Judah and Simeon, cooperating, and families functioning normally. Even so, this chapter is pervaded by unfulfilled commitment, incomplete obedience, and compromising tolerance. Even when the Israelites gain the upper hand over the Canaanites, they refuse to carry out Yahweh's agenda. Instead of reshaping the world after the image of Yahweh's will, they live in and with the world, and before long they have taken on the characteristics of the world. See that? Instead of reshaping the world after the image of Yahweh's will, they live in and with the world, and before long they have taken on the characteristics of the world. Instead of making this the land of the people of God, they become like the people of the land. This not only explains why the ages of the judges turned out to be so dark, but also serves as a permanent reminder of the deadly consequences of compromise and disobedience to all who claim to be the people of God. At the same time, the chapter announces that if anything positive is accomplished by God's people, it is because of his gracious presence and his action on his people's behalf. I think that sums it up really well. And it is what it is, as a friend of mine always says, that we look out into a world, and when man is left to his own devices, when God withdraws and lets man run things the way he wants it run, there is nothing but disaster. And that's what the whole book of Judges shows. This whole thing has been set up by just little disobedience by the nation. Nothing significant to start with. Little by little, chipping away, a little bit more of acceptance, a little bit more of compromise, and ultimately we end up with a total disaster. And if you read through the book of Judges, most of us avoid just because it's so earthy and it's so, I'd rather read the book of John where I'd be uplifted instead of read the book of Judges where I get depressed. But it's true. This is a real picture of what happens to a people who abandon God. And even believers who abandon God. That they are turned over into their own devices. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for your word, that even in this little section of Judges, that you demonstrate to us that you indeed are a wonderful, merciful God. But at the same time, you show us our weaknesses. You show us, Lord, how when we abandon you and when we are disobedient to you, that consequences occur that maybe we are not even aware of at the time. And those consequences can last for years, or they may not show their effects until many years. But you, Lord, again, have shown yourself, and as we have said in the beginning, to be faithful even despite our disobedience. So, Lord, we just ask you now to bless the rest of this day and help us, Lord, to serve you in a way that honors and glorifies you. In Jesus' name, amen.